On December 3rd, the 44th Los Angeles District Attorney was sworn into office. Well, it's only been a few days at the time of this taping, but let's get to know him a little bit better. I'm delighted to be joined today by Nathan Hochman. So nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Well, lots and lots and lots of questions, but here's a really ridiculous one to get the whole thing started. You were sworn in by former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Are you guys friends? I mean, how did all that happen? Or was that just something, there's a protocol that I'm completely unaware of that somehow went into play?
No, Governor Schwarzenegger and I have talked and sort of worked together for years now. And when it came time to figure out who would be someone I would be incredibly happy to swear me in, I was looking for someone who's just been a leader, a common sense leader out there in the world. And Governor Schwarzenegger came first on my list.
Aw.
I asked him, and he was nice enough to say yes, and I was incredibly honored to have him swear me in.
You've definitely run an incredibly successful campaign, won 60% plus of the votes. But the whole idea of, it's not as if you were not busy to begin with. It's not as if you didn't have a full-time everything. Why did you think that this was the direction that you needed to take? Why is it that you wanted to step up into this particular position at this particular time?
I'm a lifelong Angeleno. I was born here at UCLA Hospital, grew up here. I've been married now 31 years here in Los Angeles, and I've raised my 3 kids here who are now in their 20s. And I saw the situation of our safety, and I wasn't going to move. I've had plenty of friends that looked at fear entering the equation of their life, and they decided to vote with their feet, and they picked up and moved. I love Los Angeles County, and I was going to fight for what I love. And I have a fairly unique skill set that I've developed over the last 34 years in the criminal justice area. I've been a federal prosecutor, been a U.S. Assistant Attorney General, been the president of the LA City Ethics Commission, and I've been a defense attorney. And I thought I could bring that skill set to bear, plus the fact I had run for a statewide office before and understood how to campaign, and sort of marry these skill sets of being a lawyer in the courtroom, but as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, being the head of some major organizations, whether it was the tax division, the U.S. Department of Justice, or 2 major international law firms, government investigations practice, and then understanding actually how to campaign, how to build a campaign, build a team, fundraise, get out in the media, get out in the community, set up a grassroots operation, and then win an election. And so I have a very understanding wife. I ultimately gave her sort of the final veto power, but she said, look, if this is what you want to do, if this is your dream, make it happen. Work hard, we'll see what happens, it'll work, it'll not work. Thankfully, it worked out.
Anyone who's in political office, whether they be the spouse of or the actual person, is going to have a lot of eyes looking on them. That's kind of an intimidating thing, I would think.
If the spotlight comes with the office, and the office gives me the opportunity to really leverage my skill set and hopefully restore safety in this community, working with as opposed to against the 750 deputy district attorneys who are in the courtrooms every day, working with as opposed to against the tens of thousands of law enforcement officers who wanted a DA who just wants to do his job and let them do their job. If it's working with as opposed to against victim groups, victims' rights groups, they've been abandoned over the last 4 years. I've told these groups that, look, I'll resume the role that the DA's office has always been, which is their champion. I said, this is why, if the spotlight comes with that, so be it. But if I can actually accomplish the roles that a DA needs to be with the prosecutors, with the law enforcement, with victims' families, with the public, then I've hopefully contributed to creating a community that I can not only love to be part of, but so can my neighbors, so can my kids, and now I even have a grandson, 6 weeks old. And I want to create a community that is better than the community that I had the opportunity to live in.
Do you think that you have a really good insight into criminal behavior as well as the severity of crimes that maybe we haven't had in the past?
I'm the first DA in history that not only has been a prosecutor, I've been a prosecutor for about 10 years, but also a defense attorney for about 24 years. And I think that gives me an incredibly useful insight into the system and into the process. So for instance, as a defense attorney, I am working that presumption of innocence every single day. I'm ensuring that the government was meeting its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And when we went to trial, that the government had the burden to convince 12 people unanimously to find each and every element of the crime proved before they actually would render a verdict of guilty. I'm a big believer in the system. It's an adversarial system. The prosecutor needs to do his job. The defense attorneys need to do their job. You have a judge and a jury as the ultimate fact finders, and they hopefully will do their jobs. That's how our system works best. And I will bring that sort of passion for the system into the DA's office. You know, when I was sworn in, I read a quote from a Supreme Court case that I actually believe in. And it says the prosecution always wins when justice is done. That's 90 years old. It doesn't say the prosecution always wins when it gets a conviction. Because there are times where you're looking at all the evidence, even if you have a great degree of belief that someone's guilty, but you can't prove it. Or it turns out I had this situation once as a prosecutor. I had a videotape confession of the actual suspect crying at the end, admitting they did everything wrong, but turns out we had problems with the actual confession and getting the confession. So we realized we could not use the confession and all the evidence that flowed from it against that person to prove their guilt in a court of law. We chose not to bring the case. And again, difficult choice, but the right choice. Justice was actually done by us not bringing that particular case, even though we knew for a pretty high degree of certainty that the person actually did it. That's the perspective I bring into this office and will ensure all the deputy district attorneys abide by every day.
You're coming in following Gascon and his policies. Not everything is right, not everything is wrong. So there's a three-part, are you going to keep any of his policies that you feel were solid and worth pursuing? What do you consider to be draconian? And how do you get the politics out of the office? And I'm just going to be fascinated to hear what's going on.
So I reject extreme policies on both ends of the pendulum swing. George Gascon came in with what he called decarceration policies. What did that mean? That certain crimes and certain criminals would not be prosecuted, not because of the weakness in the facts or the differences in the law, but because of his personal political agenda that he brought in. A couple examples. If you were a gang member who committed a violent crime as part of your participation in the gang, there's something called a gang enhancement.
Right.
Been on the books for 30 years. State legislature put it on the books and created a law to try and cripple criminal street gangs that were terrorizing their communities. So that had been used up until George Gascon. He comes in with a blanket policy saying under no circumstances whatsoever would it ever be alleged. I reject that policy. I reject policies that are blanket. I reject policies that are extreme. And I'm not going to replace when I've already eliminated these extreme Gascon policies with extreme mass incarceration policies. Another set of policies trying to put people in jail for as long as possible without a consideration of the facts of the law. Where I come down is what I call the hard work middle or the hard middle. And the reason it takes work is that blanket policies are inherently lazy. They're reckless. That the hard middle policies look at each case individually, the individual defendant, the defendant's background, the crime committed and the impact on the victim, to determine who the true threats are to our public safety, and those are often the repeat offenders who need to be behind bars, and the ones that aren't. For example, your first-time nonviolent offender still has to pay back a debt to society if they violate society's laws. But that's where non-prison alternatives come to play. Community service, restitution, pay it back if you stole something. Or if you have a serious drug addiction that got you to do the crime, we'll give you a diversion program that offers you the choice. Go to prison or go through an 18-month rigorous, one day at a time rehab program that if you successfully get to the end of, will give you a certificate and wipe the crime off your record. That is what the hard middle approach will do to replace the Gasconian extreme blanket policies that had emboldened criminals. Because my ultimate job is not to fill the prisons to the breaking point. If anything, that's the failure of the criminal justice system. What I intend to do is deter criminals from committing those crimes in the first place. That's saving a whole lot of victims in the process. And when you ask me what policies I might keep on from Gascon, I would say that I can do, and my background as a defense attorney prepares me for real and effective criminal justice reform. So for instance, police accountability cases. I'm the only DA in history that's actually personally prosecuted a police officer. Did it back in the 1990s with a team of federal prosecutors. We went after elite deputy sheriffs that were unfortunately stealing drugs, guns, and money from drug dealers. We went ahead and put them all in jail. I have no tolerance whatsoever for a police officer who crosses the line and commits criminal conduct. However, I believe that the overwhelming numbers of police officers are doing a very difficult and dangerous job extremely well every single day. And those officers will get my respect, they'll get my admiration, and as DA, they will have my partnership. But I will go after the outlier officers that cross the law better than my predecessor. In fact, what's interesting is when I speak to the heads of the law enforcement departments, they tell me that nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. Because those few bad cops ruin the reputation for them all, and I'll ensure that those few bad cops have a reckoning with justice if they cross the line. Exonerating the factually innocent. That started with Jackie Lacey, it continued on with George Gascon, and it will absolutely continue on with myself. I have visited clients, people, in jails and in prisons up and down the state of California. Every day you spend in jail is a horrible day. But if you have to spend a day in jail and you are factually innocent, the DA's office needs to get you out of jail immediately, and I will. And dealing with explicit and implicit racial bias, the state legislature has given us a couple additional tools in the last several years. One's called the Racial Justice Act, and one's called the Racially Blind Charging Act. The idea behind both of them is they're putting tools in place for either the prosecutors on the front end to make sure they're not making decisions based on either explicit racial bias. For instance, that somehow they blessed a case where two officers are discussing they want to go after someone because of their race. Or implicit racial bias, where certain charges were being used just against people from a certain race. You need to eliminate that from the upfront decision making, and that's where the Racially Blind Charging Act comes into play. The Racial Justice Act says we're going to give defense lawyers the ability to request information from the government or a DA's office to see if any of this is out there. And if it is, they can then file a motion with the judge to allow the judge to actually dismiss the charge or in some cases dismiss the entire case. So the DA's office has to be prepared for it. It has to be willing to respond to it. And as importantly, do its absolute best to ensure that there is no explicit or implicit racial bias in the prosecution at all. And so I will continue on those policies. If anything, I will amp them up and make them much more real and effective while prioritizing public safety. Two things, both real and effective criminal justice reform and prioritizing public safety, that my predecessor completely failed.
What is factually innocent?
What is factually innocent? You didn't do the crime.
So why is that person incarcerated in the first place?
So often, I mean, you've heard about the cases over the years with DNA analysis.
Yeah.
So for instance, there are cases, and again, the Innocence Project and a lot of the factually innocent determinations, and I'll use the example of DNA evidence where you might have had 3 eyewitnesses that said this particular person committed this crime, and it happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. Turns out, though, that with the advent of certain technology, with the advent of additional information and witnesses coming forward years later, that you can actually prove that that particular person who went through the whole system, got convicted by a jury, got upheld on appeal, didn't actually do the crime. That happens. And when it happens, it doesn't happen that often, but when it absolutely happens, the DA's office has to move on that. It has to make sure that person gets released from prison, and that the court actually gives a declaration of what's called factual innocence.
I had never heard of that. That's fascinating. And then you brought up a lot of really interesting things in addition to that, but also the level of crime in which someone can be arrested. There's you're talking about just safety and making sure that somebody is responsible for their actions. So how is that going to change? Because that's obviously been something where some crimes, including theft and shoplifting, have been just almost, they have to, it's not even worth calling it in because nobody's going to do anything about it.
So the days where police officers will tell victims that our hands are tied by the DA's
Right.
office are done.
Okay.
Each case will be looked at in terms of, is the evidence there? I mean, we have to prove that evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Is the evidence legally admissible? Did the police obtain the evidence correctly? And each of those cases presented to the DA's office will now be given a fair shot. And ultimately what will happen is, again, the goal is, for instance, 50 recently on social media, you might have seen it, where 50 12 to 15-year-olds biked to a 7-Eleven,
Right.
dropped their bikes in front of it, ran inside, ransacked the place, got back on their bike, stuffed their pants with stolen goods, and biked away.
Right.
Why did that happen in 2024 when, quite honestly, I've lived here, good part of my 61 years. I've never seen that before. I've never even heard of that happening before, but it happened in 2024. I think what ultimately the answer is that those kids thought that it wasn't against the law, that nothing was going to happen. And they were, for the most part, absolutely right. DA had a policy saying if you're a juvenile under 18 and you steal just under $950, which is a misdemeanor, the DA had an actual policy saying that the DA's office would not prosecute that case at all. And you know who was paying attention to that policy? Those kids. Even if they didn't physically read the policy, they knew the policy existed. That policy has been rescinded on my day one, 2 days ago. And again, with respect to that, now we're going to have to get the message out to the kids. And part of that message is they will be held accountable. Does it mean we're going to institute mass incarceration and put a bunch of 12 to 15-year-olds in prison? Of course not. But they will be held accountable. If they have to do community service, we'll figure out community service for these kids. They have to understand there are consequences for these actions. And by the way, the notion that there are not consequences for actions, that is a dangerous concept to embed in young people. Because eventually those teenagers will grow up to be in their 20s and 30s. And they have the perspective that just certain laws they can break and there are no consequences to them. God help us in the future. But we're going to stop. We have basically going to reverse that and stop that starting on my first day one. And again, the message will be consistent, it will be fair, it will be impartial, but there will be real consequences on the other side of the line. And I'm hoping that we can duplicate 2014. Why did I pick out that day instead of the 60s or 1960s or 70s? Turns out 10 years ago was considered our safest year in LA County in the last 50 years. Oh. And why was that? The DA was doing her job. That was Jackie Lacey. Law enforcement had a partner in the DA's office, and they were doing their jobs. Victims understood that if you dialed 911, not only would someone pick up the phone, but you could get justice for the harm you suffered. And as importantly, the criminals understood that the lines in society, which are the laws, were being enforced consistently, fairly, and impartially, and those were the real consequences on the other side of those lines. And in record numbers, 10 years ago, the criminals were not committing the crimes, thus saving a whole lot of victims in the process. That's my goal.
Also, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking is the DA's office, correct me if I'm wrong, on average has 180,000 cases. And you've also said that you want to make sure that every case is looked at. How is your staff feeling about that? How are your assistant DAs feeling about that? How is that going to be managed just in terms of logistics? That's a pretty impressive caseload for any country, let alone the County of Los Angeles.
You're right. I mean, the County of Los Angeles, if it was a state in the United States, it would be the 8th largest state.
Yeah.
My budget will be somewhere around $500 million. And I've got 2,100 employees, about 750 of them are prosecutors, and we're hiring right now. So if anyone out there who's watching this, please get ready to sign up for and apply to the LA County DA's office. But how are we going to go about this? I am lucky to be inheriting some of the best, most talented, diverse lawyers in the country. For the last 4 years, however, these folks have been on the front line of trying to bring the mission of justice in these courtrooms and not having the DA have their back. I basically said, when I started meeting with them back in March and got the endorsement of their union, I said, I know endorsements are nice. I need to meet with these folks. I've met with over 500 of them individually. And I basically said to them two things. I said, the greatest resource of a DA's office is not the courtrooms, the cases, or the computers. It's the deputy district attorneys themselves doing justice in all these courtrooms across the county every single day. And so what is my role as a district attorney? My role is to maximize the greatest resource, which is them. So I told them, you need training, done. Resources, done. Credit for the good work that you're doing. George Gascon used to have press conferences where you would swear to God the only person who did all the work was him. That somehow he investigated the case, tried the case, convicted the people, sentenced the people, all by himself because he was the only one there. I will give credit where credit is due. I said, you work hard. You achieve that success, you get the credit. And I said, and the reason I say that to him is there's thinking behind it. I need them to work incredibly hard. We're dealing with a big hole. We're down 20% of our workforce, over 200 lawyers. We have 10,000 unfiled cases that I have to inherit and will deal with immediately. I need these folks to work harder than they've ever worked. And they have said to me, hallelujah. We are so fired up to do the mission of justice. I mean, these are people who've dedicated their whole career to being prosecutors. They wanted a DA to let them do their job, to apply their collective thousands of years of prosecutorial experience to figure out the right result in each and every case. And I've said, look, that's me. I will have your back. Go do your job. So even though it is a mountain that we are climbing, and not a small one at that, I've got the world-class mountain climbers right behind me, to the side of me. Hey, they're help me pull me up the mountain itself. They know that I have their backs at all points, and we are going to accomplish this mission.
Do you have the tools that those mountain climbers need? Do you have, the courts, the judges, the officers, all the peripherals that you need as well, or is that also something that needs to sort of be reevaluated in your mind?
No, we have the tools.
You have the tools.
I've at my swearing in, I was fortunate enough to have the sheriff, Robert Luna of LA, the LA Sheriff's Department, and the LAPD Chief Jim McDonald there, as well as a whole bunch of leaders of the local law enforcement agencies across the county. This is another group that has been demoralized, and in part of their demoralization has been the DA's office hasn't been willing to bring a lot of those cases that they are bringing to the DA's office. And they rejected them not because of the facts or the law weren't there, but because of the DA's personal political agenda. Back to your question about taking politics out of the office, that political agenda is gone. I've told folks, we're back to the facts and the law. Bring us these cases. We'll give every one of these cases a fair shot. So I've got the law enforcement officers fired up, and their leadership is absolutely committed to bringing this mission of justice. Victims groups are responding to us. We're going to be certainly working with the courts because there might be a higher workload in the courts as we get more and more of these cases processed. I've got to work with the public defender's office, the alternate public defender's office, the probation office. Ultimately, we'll have to work with the sheriff's department dealing with the jail system, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation if we're dealing with the prison system. But this is why I'm doing this job. I mean, what I just described, some people would view as a challenge. Some people would view it as a burden. I'm viewing it as the opportunity of a lifetime. And so, I come in with that perspective, and I try to imbue that perspective to everybody I touch. And I must tell you, the energy that I have experienced from people who are revitalized to go do the mission of justice in this county is intoxicating.
You inherited a very high-profile case that was quite the front line of every media organization everywhere. It's actually in the judge's hands. Where's the DA's office fit in right now with the Menendez trial?
So the Menendez case is on 3 different tracks right now. The first track is called a habeas track. What happened is in May of 2023, they filed the initial habeas motion that said we have some new evidence. And this new evidence is compelling enough, according to the defense, that it should merit a new trial for the Menendezes 30 plus years after their original trial. So that is on one track. There's actually briefing that's due on that track coming up. And if that happens, they would get a new trial. The second track is a direct shot to the governor for clemency. That is, that does not in many ways even involve the DA's office. The governor, from the day he set foot in the governor's mansion years ago until today, or tomorrow, or the next day, could grant clemency to the Menendez brothers and release them from prison. The third track is something called resentencing. Resentencing is somewhat unique to California. The legislature has been passing laws and tinkering with those laws for years now, but it effectively says that there are certain conditions. They actually list a number of factors, that if those factors are met, the DA's office can file a motion to begin the process, and then ultimately give the judge the power, if the judge so wants, to reduce a sentence. In this case, in the Menendez case, it's life without the possibility of parole to life with the possibility of parole. Now, I'll give you a couple of hypotheticals. If the judge decides to do that, and right now the current recommendation is 50 years to life. So take a life without the possibility of parole sentence, make it a 50 years to life sentence. Then what would happen, it would go to the parole board. The parole board could then schedule a parole hearing. At that hearing, they have their own list of factors that they look at to see if someone is not just eligible for parole, but should be released on parole. Let's say hypothetically the parole board decides to then release the Menendez brothers on parole. That decision is not automatic. That then goes to the governor's office. The governor has 120 days to weigh in on that decision. He can do one of three things. He can agree with it. He can send it back to a review of the entire parole board, because the initial parole board that looks at it is just two people. Or he can reverse it. An example of where the governor has reversed recently a grant of parole by the parole board is the case of Sirhan, the assassin of Robert F. Kennedy back in 1968, actually here in Los Angeles. For 40 years and 15 parole hearings, the parole board denied parole to Sirhan. But in 2022, George Gascon refused to send a prosecutor with the Kennedy family to the parole hearing. By the way, that blanket policy I reversed on day one too. And in large part because the prosecutor wasn't there. For the first time in 2022, the parole board granted Sirhan parole. The governor actually stepped in that case and reversed that grant of parole, keeping Sirhan behind bars. So ultimately, if it goes this path, the governor will have the final say.
Well, welcome to the DA's office. I mean, now that we've been sitting here, it's just been just a few days. I really look forward to chatting with you in a few months to see how things are progressing, because you have done everything you promised on day one. So congratulations on that, and welcome to your new responsibility that you obviously are relishing. And it's been great to get to know you. And if people want to see what the DA's office is doing and they want to learn, what you've enacted or taken away or put in place, or even to apply for a job, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
So the website is an excellent portal to start. It's da.lacounty.gov. Other places you can hit us on Instagram, X, all the different social media outlets as well. And what I encourage people is, look, if the Menendez case is interesting to you, use that as your springboard to get involved in criminal justice issues. Stuff's fascinating. And the Menendez case is just sort of a microcosm of all the different issues in play in any particular criminal case. And if that's what gets people interested in the criminal justice system, then the Menendez case has actually served a purpose well beyond the case itself.
Well, I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.